This is going to be Secrets of the Battlefield of Gettysburg, and we're going to be looking at trees that have dog tags in them, that have National Park Service tags that are not witness trees. And you see a couple over here, and there's a bunch here. You can see the shiny silver tags. And what these are, and by the way, I'm standing here where the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad once crossed. And we did a video series on the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad. What these small trees are with tags are actually, it is one of several areas on the Gettysburg National Military Park where the park actually does a study of trees. They study trees, they study the effects of weather and wildlife on the trees. If the wildlife digs holes into the trees and causes them to die, and they place these tags here in the ground, or rather on the trees, and identify them. Like this one says National Park Service number 1161, and then every few years they study the effects. Also in the ground is a marker that talks about what I'm talking about now. It says Forest Monitoring Plot number 30, National Park Service, as a part of their inventory and monitoring. Now they spend quite a bit of money. I actually contacted the park at one time about this after I had discovered it, and they told me exactly what they do. They spend quite a bit of money actually just doing monitoring of trees and the effects on trees from wildlife and from brush and natural things. So this is one of the controversial things. Is the money being well spent in national parks when we can spend hundreds, thousands of dollars to monitor trees but not keep up with other areas or facilities on the national parks? And again, you see the forest monitoring station number 30 in the ground, as well as many markers placed on trees, which can be confusing to some people because the park actually identified witness trees at one time in the same way. This is Station 30. Also, one of the secrets of the battlefield is this iron marker placed by the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad in 1884, which used to have a informational directional sign on it. As the train would come in this area by here, heading toward Little Round Top, it would blow its whistle and let the populated area and the Round Top Park know that it was nearby. This has been Secrets of the Battlefield, forest monitoring, and the informational directional sign of the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. To the battlefield, the wounding spot of Major General Winfield Scott Hancock here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And in the distance you can see the Corridori Farm. You can see the high water mark over here, and then the Pennsylvania Monument here. Now some people have asked me, where was Hancock wounded? If you watch the movie Gettysburg, as Pickett's charge is coming across the field, and that's depicted by Robert E. Lee's Virginia Monument today, Pickett's charge coming across the field, it appears that Hancock is wounded not too far from the copse of trees in the angle. As he's talking in the movie, he's hit by a ball, and one of his aides comes to him and tells him that he must get himself off the field, and he refuses to do so. But actually, Hancock was wounded almost a quarter of a mile south of the copse of trees. And here, friends and comrades of Major General Hancock erected this monument here at the spot he was wounded. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg, Hancock wasn't standing here on this rise looking at the battle, having himself at risk. Actually, this area at one time sat in a hollow, and he was actually protected. That was later destroyed when the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Round Top Spur train came in, and also when they built the Pennsylvania Monument. The hill monument was brought over into this area and piled here on this hill. This whole area that has a hill today actually looked much different in 1863, and members of a New York Union regiment, as well as some Florida soldiers, mentioned that during the 1913 reunion. But again, this has been Secrets of the Battlefield. the wounding of Major General Winfield Scott Hancock and the location he was wounded on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Okay, this is going to be Secrets of the Battlefield, and today we're going to look at a piece of Gettysburg that is no longer here. It was once known as the Shields Museum. Now, the Shields Museum was opened by a man named Arthur Shields in 1925, and that museum once sat right here in this little field right next to the Reynolds, Buford, and Maine Battery Monument that you see in front of us here. And I'll post a picture before I post the video of the now and then of this site. But the Shields Museum, again, a man named Arthur Shields had this museum in 1925. Arthur Shields was a collector of Civil War memorabilia, and more specifically, memorabilia from the Battle of Gettysburg. He opened a museum here in 1925, and that museum featured items that were collected from the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, not only were they collected from the Gettysburg battlefield, but Mr. Shields collected some of these himself, and some of the earliest collections from the Gettysburg battlefield, from the 1860s on through the 1880s, actually purchased by Mr. Shields and housed inside the museum. It has been called at one point the last authentic Civil War museum at Gettysburg. And the reason for that is today when you come to Gettysburg, a lot of museums claim to have bullets and different artifacts collected on the battlefield by early visitors, and then of course after you were no longer allowed to take off the battlefield, people began to go to privately owned farms and take relics off those as they metal detected through the area. A lot of those collections are suspect, however. Some of the earliest items were collected and housed in the Shields Museum here. Now, the museum, which once sat right here in this open field here, was closed in 1985. And it sat here right on the corner of Stone Avenue and the Chambersburg Pike, right next to the Buford and Reynolds and Dow Maine Battery monuments that you see there in front of us. As Gettysburg began in the 80s, 90s, and now at the turn of the new century to try to bring the battlefield back to its 1863 appearance, a lot of modern intrusions have been taken away, this being one of them. This is the site of the former Arthur Shields Museum here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Cemetery here in Gettysburg. And of course, at one time, this cemetery was actually part of the route of the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad Round Top Spur, which ran right along the cemetery here, and then out by the McMillan Farm and toward the fields of Pickett's Charge. But today, we're going to be looking at the Coeur Doré plot here at St. Francis. And of course, the grave to the left is that of Nicholas J. Coeur Doré, who was in the 165th and 210th Pennsylvania Volunteers. He owned property here in Gettysburg. We've looked at those houses in another video. That is the grave that he occupies here. And the grave in the center here is a man named George Jean Coeur Doré. He was born in 1806 and he died in 1865. And as a part of our Secrets of the Battlefield, we did take a look at the George Jean Coeur Doré house. This is his grave site. He, again, was one of 8 prisoners of war, hostages that were taken by the Confederate Army here on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863, and probably the saddest one. It was here, nearby where his house stood, that he was taken prisoner, and then taken to prisons in both Richmond, Virginia, and Salisbury, North Carolina. And he was held for a year and a half as a civilian in prison. Now, as the Confederacy collapsed in February of 1865, their government found it fit to release these prisoners of war, since they could no longer afford to continue to feed and take care of them, and they posed no threat, not being of a military nature. Coradori was released in February of 1865, and he walked a good deal of the way home from Richmond, Virginia, to his hometown here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And on March the 23rd, 1865, just about a week after arriving in town, he died of the disease that he had contracted while he was in a military prison. The very day he died, on March 23rd of 1865, the Pennsylvania legislature released a statement stating that, and issued this to the Confederate government that was collapsing, that all prisoners of war, hostages that were civilians that were taken during the Gettysburg battle, must be released. Unfortunately, it was too late for Mr. George John Coradori, who had passed away. He's buried here today in the old section of the St. Francis of Xavier Cemetery, Catholic Cemetery here in Gettysburg, not far from the cross, and the Coradori plot sits here. This has been Secrets of the Battlefield, the grave of George John Coradori, Confederate hostage of war, who was a hostage from July of 1863 through March of 1865, when he arrived back here in town and died. On Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.